I'm Zev Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College, and I'm joined today by Professor Marni Davis, Associate Professor of History at Georgia State University in Atlanta. And as I was thinking about our conversation today, number one, the author, of course, of Sammy Rohr Prize finalist, Jews and Booze, which we've said before on with so many people, and everybody seems to agree that it is the greatest title that has been furnished in the historiography of American Jews.
You're welcome.
But we all get to footnote you.
Yeah.
But something more than that, your book about Jewish economics, about the liquor industry, about anti-Semitism, about the limits of pluralism, what it really does provide is I think was a watershed moment for historians to talk about economics and anti-Semitism and the Jewish experience in American Protestantism with an incredibly useful scaffolding.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I guess I want to also make clear that I'm not an economist and I'm not trained in economics. So when I was doing my work, I was really thinking of this as a work of socioeconomics, I guess. As a social historian, first and foremost, I was interested in how do the economic roles that people play in American society, both as producers and purveyors, but also as consumers, as well as laborers, as workers and employers. How do those roles affect our social interactions with one another in their own particular contexts, and how do those change over time? So I think that the socioeconomics of the liquor industry has been really crucial.
Right. And your book is laid out like that in terms of and how Jews played a role in all different sides. How did Jews emerge within the liquor trade, both as purveyors and consumers?
Right. Well, I think it's fair to say that Jews would not have engaged the American alcohol trade as robustly as they did if the American alcohol trade hadn't been as robust as it was to begin with. The United States was known from its inception as kind of a heavy drinking culture and a place where alcohol, especially first rum, but then after the Revolution, rum became sort of an unpatriotic drink. So whiskey replaced it as sort of the patriotic distilled alcohol. But yeah, so whiskey and beer primarily were very sort of voraciously consumed in the United States. So that's the context into which Jewish immigrants from both Central Europe and then a little bit later Eastern Europe came to this American economy, production economy, commodity culture. And they came with their own experience in the liquor industry from Eastern and Central Europe in a wide range of fields. And so they arrived in the United States with some idea of not just idea, but perhaps from their own experience of how they might actually set up their own business or engage in a family member's business, but also that there was just some familiarity. Selling alcohol seemed like, for an Eastern European Jew from the Pale of Settlement, selling alcohol was a pretty common Jewish trade. And so to come to the United States, there's some continuity there. So I would say that it's the continuity from their immigrant that they were bringing with them from immigrating from Europe, but also the importance of the American economic context and commodity context was so crucial, because without it, they might have just abandoned it and found another line of work.
And they landed into a very fraught condition of the Temperance movement and Prohibition, which of course was mainly a Protestant movement, also a female Protestant movement, which is quite
almost entirely at first. I mean, I really start my story in the 1870s, which is exactly when the Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed in 1873, 1874, following the first anti-alcohol crusade of the post-Civil War era. And this was, I think that it's worth keeping in mind that this was regarded as kind of a fringe movement. There were certainly churches that took it up, but most of those churches were on the sort of evangelical Protestant side. But there were plenty of churches who regarded it as regarded the movement itself as far too extreme and regarded its gendered nature as kind of repulsive. The idea that women would enter the public sphere in such an aggressive way and engage in civil disobedience was seen as anathema to many Americans. And so when Jews, some of whom had been part of the liquor industry in the United States and some of whom had not and were just, politically engaged Jewish Americans, when they spoke out against the Prohibition movement, the Temperance and Prohibition movement of the late 19th century, they were not alone. It's not they who were on the fringe. They were among many native-born Americans, also German American immigrants who all rejected the Prohibition movement. So this was regarded as the wet side of the debate as opposed to the dry side of the debate. The wet side of the debate was, for a long time, the dominating argument, the winning argument. It just that over the course of several decades that it became the losing argument.
And when it becomes a losing argument, all of a sudden Jews, in some sense, they don't dominate. Their numbers don't dominate the field, but they're very visible in some places, especially, and in an environment that is increasingly, I think it's important to recognize that the Prohibition movement and American anti-Semitism kind of emerge, I guess it's fair to say, sort of in tandem with one another and become intertwined. And so at precisely the moment where economic anti-Semitism is emerging in American life as a more powerful force, it also becomes a component of the anti-alcohol movement starting in the 1880s, but with real force in the very early 20th century. And you see it articulated with, I guess the loudest voice on that front is Henry Ford, who writes in the Dearborn Independent about what he feels to be American Jews, not just their destruction of the American alcohol industry through their modes of commodity production, but also an idea that Jews are always only out for their own financial gain, their own economic remuneration, and are uninterested in the health and well-being of the rest of their country, of their neighbors, which is really, it's an articulation of the classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theory about Jews and economic behavior. Right, and so Henry Ford and put the Leo Frank affair, of course, in there as well in the 1910s. And whereas previously, this is what I meant about what Jews and Booze, its great contribution, was that instead of following certain tropes and understanding of anti-Semitism, what Jews in the alcohol trade allow us to better visualize is how Jews found a place which they were on the winning side, as you point out early on. But then when the story is flipped, because of religious and cultural changes and because of economic changes, all of a sudden Jews are re-scripted.
Yeah, I think that's right. As American culture changes around them, no one could have foreseen the future. I think that probably if you had asked a lot of American Jews in the late 19th century, is like, do you think that there's going to be a constitutional amendment banning all beverage alcohol? It would have been seen as like a silly prediction. You can't foresee the future like that. But because of other transformations of American culture, and especially, I think it's fair to say, because of the First World War, that and also the success of movements like the Anti-Saloon League, which was not an anti-Semitic movement by any stretch. But I get maybe you could say the success of the Anti-Saloon League at the same time as the growth of the Ku Klux Klan, which certainly was anti-Semitic and also like staunchly prohibitionist. That as these movements gain force in American society, it puts American Jews sort of back on their heels in a way that they wouldn't have possibly expected. Because previously, both their economic role as producers of and purveyors of alcohol, but also their political position, which wasn't just that alcohol should be made, which should remain legal, but also to say something like, look at us. We drink alcohol all the time. We drink 4 glasses of wine on Passover, and don't even get us started about Purim. Like, alcohol is part of our culture, and yet they insist we are not drunkards. Now, in my book, I do not engage with this question of Jewish alcohol consumption in a way that I think a lot of people would like to know more about. Did Jews actually drink to excess in a way that their own rhetoric about themselves ignored? And I don't know if I can answer that question. I don't know if there's really any evidence one way or another, but I do know the use to which this idea that, as one rabbi put it, the Jew drinks, but he knows when to stop. This rhetoric was put to political use during the Prohibition movement. So Jews could say, we are both, if American society has a problem with alcohol, but it clearly also has a problem with these teetotalers and these Prohibition radicals. But we are the solution to both of these problems. We drink and we don't drink to excess. So look to us as a model of a patriotic American that is a defender of the Constitution. I mean, that's an amazing thing to be able to do, but that's not a tenable position when the Prohibition movement changes and transforms and starts to develop more of an economic argument into which economic anti-Semitism can fit very neatly.
So as Jews try to recast their role, which they've been essentially recast over the sweep of the Prohibition movement, what happens to this discourse? What is this very charged period in the first, I'd say, 2 decades of the 20th century? How does the Jewish position in Protestant America, how is that formed and changed?
Well, I would say that from what the evidence that I found, American Jews were, they did not, with the exception of very few, for instance, Rabbi Stephen Wise, by the American engagement in the First World War, he became a defender of the idea of a Prohibition amendment. But most American Jews most decidedly were not. And they are dragged kicking and screaming into the Prohibition era, to be quite honest. So I would say that it's really that decade during the Prohibition era, from 1920 to 1930 or so, where American Jews really kind of recognize that they are forced to rethink their self-presentation and their rhetoric about the role of alcohol in their own culture and in American culture. And what happens is chaos because different Jews have different ideas, it turns out, about what the role of American Jews should be in the Prohibition era. And some continue to make a living in the illegal side, in the underground liquor market. Some of them really famously and kind of like anti-heroic glamorously, and some on a very small scale. And others try to make sure that American Jews are following the law so I should say here that one of the most important components of this story of Jews and the Prohibition movement specifically, or the Prohibition era, I should say, is that there was a special dispensation within the Prohibition law, within the Volstead Act, that gave Jews and other religious groups that wanted to use wine in their religious, in their sacramental, for sacramental purposes, gave them access to a certain amount of wine. But this gave rise to what was known as the rabbinic wine scandals of the early 1920s, where, some people who weren't rabbis sort of claimed rabbinic authority so that they could access this wine and then just sort of sell it on the underground market. Some rabbis actually engaged in this underground market too, but Orthodox Jews were confronted by, this is sort of a interdenominational debate too, because Reform Jews, the Reform Jewish sort of institutional authorities decided, well, what we need to do in order to make sure that we are following the law and that we are not seen as breaking the law because we can, because that feeds into anti-Semitic tropes as well. What we need to do is just decide, like, as a religious community, we're just not going to access sacramental wine. We can live without it. We can use unfermented wine instead. And the Orthodox Jewish authorities in New York, they say, no way. We're following the law. The law says we have access to this wine. We're not going to change our religious practices that have been part of our culture for thousands of years just because you guys are scared. So how do Jews respond to prohibition? There are as many different answers to that as there are, Jewish communities.
Right. And I think one of its lasting legacies is how bulloxed the rabbinical position is. Who is a rabbi? Who can appoint a rabbi? And that comes up in Congress in their investigations. Fascinating archival sources, which you found.
Yeah.
And also Jewish politics is forever complicated through the 1910s to the 1920s. And even if Prohibition ended, these questions linger.
Of course. And so one of the things that that I was so excited about when I found this topic when I was a graduate student was it made me realize just how much the whole war on liquor story had come to be regarded as of a bygone era and quaint. So like people back then were, they were so different from us. But when you start to think about the story of anti-Semitism and Jewish engagement in this trade and how central this argument was about alcohol in American life and how much it affected Jews' standing in American culture and their ability to support themselves and their communities and to achieve upward mobility, that all had been so lost in our sort of historical forgetting about how much this debate roiled the nation for a century.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.